Okay, I have a question for you. When I say the word Atlantis, be honest, where does your brain go?
Oh, if I'm being really honest, I picture a cartoon seahorse, maybe Jason Momoa with a trident,
Right.
or, one of those late night cable documentaries that always seems to air right after the infomercials for nonstick pans.
Exactly. It feels like the definition of fringe. It's comic books, it's conspiracy theories, it's pseudo-history.
It's the kind of thing you talk about if you want people to slowly back away from you at a party.
Usually, yes.
Yeah.
But today, we're going to completely dismantle that image.
We are. Because we're taking a deep dive into a very specific moment in history, the second half of the 18th century, where Atlantis wasn't a joke, it wasn't a punchline.
It was serious, cutting-edge science.
That's the key. We aren't talking about fistics or, cult leaders here. We are talking about the Milanese Enlightenment. We are talking about the intellectual heavyweights of Europe.
These are not fringe characters.
Not at all. We're talking economists, astronomers, members of the Royal Academies. These guys were corresponding with Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin. And for them, Atlantis wasn't magic. It was the missing variable in a very complex equation about the history of the Earth itself.
It's just so weird to think about, isn't it? That you could be a man of science in the 1700s, and your serious academic work would include pinpointing the location of a lost continent.
It was almost necessary. You have to remember, this was before Darwin, before plate tectonics. They were looking at fossils on mountains. They were looking at ancient myths from all over the world. And they were trying to build a single cohesive theory of how the world evolved.
And Atlantis was the glue.
Atlantis was the bridge that made the math work. It explained everything.
And at the center of this whole thing, as we're going to see in this deep dive, we have a feud, a massive intellectual duel between two men who absolutely hated each other's theories.
On one side, we have Gian Rinaldo Carli. He's essentially an economist, a scholar from the Venetian Republic, worked in Milan, a very pragmatic numbers guy.
And in the other corner,
Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the rock star astronomer of France, a brilliant mathematician, member of the Academy of Sciences, and this is important later, eventually a major political figure in the French Revolution.
So an economist versus an astronomer.
Yeah.
And they are fighting over what exactly? Just where the island was?
No, it's so much more than geography. They are fighting over the origins of human intelligence, the cradle of civilization itself.
Okay.
They are fighting over whether civilization started in the warm, sunny Atlantic or, and this is where it gets really wild, in the Arctic.
The Arctic, you mean like Spitsbergen, ice and polar bears and nothing?
Exactly. Bailey, the brilliant astronomer, was absolutely convinced that the Garden of Eden, the cradle of all science and art, was located on an island near the North Pole.
I cannot wait to hear the logic behind that, because that sounds on its face completely insane.
It sounds insane to us. To him, based on the physics of cooling bodies, it was practically a mathematical certainty. But we'll get there.
Okay, but before we get into the comets and the polar paradises, I want to frame this for everyone listening. Why are we talking about this today? Is this just a fun, quirky history story, or is there a bigger point?
There is a massive point, and the source material we're working from by Elio Antonello makes this argument beautifully. This whole story is a mirror. This debate from the 1780s highlights the exact same problems we have in science and history today.
Which is what?
It's about the fixed idea.
The fixed idea.
Yeah. It's that moment where a hypothesis turns into an obsession, when you stop looking for evidence to test your theory and you start twisting the world to fit the theory you've already fallen in love with.
And that's what happened to these guys.
Carli and Bailly were geniuses, but they both fell into this trap in their own ways. And it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. What scientific truths do we believe right now just because we want them to be true?
That is a terrifying thought. Okay, let's set the scene then. It's the 1780s. The Enlightenment is in full swing. We've got cafes, wigs, revolutions are brewing. And into this walks Gian Rinaldo Carli. You said he was an economist?
Yes. For most of his life, he had a long, distinguished career in public economy. He dealt with currency reform, trade balances, census data. A practical man.
Grounded in reality.
Very. But then he retires.
And retirement is a dangerous thing for a smart person with too much time on their hands.
It is precisely that. He decides to write a book. And it's called Lettere Americane, or The American Letters, published between 1780 and 1783.
Okay, letters. Why that format? Why not The Definitive History of America or something grand like that.
The format really matters here. It wasn't a dry academic textbook. He wrote it in his own words, freely and colloquially. He even called it a poem in prose.
So it was meant to be read, to be enjoyed.
Exactly. It was designed for the educated public, not just stuffy professors. He presented it almost as a pastime for himself, a sort of intellectual hobby.
A bit like a blog series today. Or a Substack.
That's a fantastic analogy. Yeah, a series of long intellectual essays sent to a friend, which were then published. But because of who Carli was, these casual letters got very serious attention.
Right.
They were translated into multiple languages, and a copy was even sent to Benjamin Franklin.
Okay, I have to pause on that. Benjamin Franklin, founding father, kite flyer, diplomat in Paris, is sitting down to read a retired Italian economist's theories about Atlantis.
It sounds so bizarre to us today, but you have to understand the concept of the Republic of Letters.
I've heard that term before, but what does it actually mean in practice? What did that look like?
Well, imagine if the intellectual world wasn't divided into these rigid silos we have now. Today, a biologist talks to other biologists. An economist talks to other economists.
And they use jargon that no one else can understand.
Right. If, say, Elon Musk wrote a book on ancient Aztec pottery, the entire academic world would laugh him out of the room. But in the 18th century, the smart people were just the smart people.
It was more of a free-for-all.
It was an open market of ideas. An economist could write about geology, an astronomer could write about ancient history, and people like Franklin or Voltaire would read all of it.
Why?
Because they believed that reason, with a capital R, was a universal tool. If you were smart enough to figure out how to fix the Venetian currency, you were probably smart enough to figure out where the Aztecs came from.
I see. So there was no stay-in-your-lane mentality.
None whatsoever. And Carli drove straight into the biggest, most controversial lane of all, the Americas. His book basically had two main pillars.
Okay.
First, a passionate defense of pre-Columbian civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas. And second, a grand geological theory of Atlantis to explain how they all got there.
Let's start with that first pillar, the defense of the Americas.
Yeah.
Why did they need defending? I mean, by the 1780s, Europeans had known about the Americas for almost 300 years.
They knew about them, but they didn't respect them. The prevailing academic view was, frankly, incredibly racist. And this brings us to the villain of our story.
Ooh, a villain.
A man named Cornelius de Pauw.
Villain is a strong word for a historian.
In this context, I think he deserves it. De Pauw was a Dutch geographer, a diplomat, and in the late 1700s, he was considered Europe's foremost authority on the Americas. He wrote the definitive encyclopedic entries. He was the guy everyone cited.
So he must have spent years traveling the Andes, exploring the Amazon jungle.
He never set foot there, not once.
You're kidding me.
Not at all. He sat in his study in Europe and just theorized about a place he'd never seen.
The classic armchair expert.
Yeah.
But worse.
So much worse. Because his theories were incredibly influential and incredibly damaging. De Pauw propagated what was called the theory of degeneracy.
Degeneracy, what does that mean?
He believed that the climate and the geography of the Americas were fundamentally broken. He argued that the humidity, the supposedly swampy nature of the continent caused everything living there to degenerate, to become a lesser version of itself.
Wait. He thought the humidity made people inferior.
He thought it made everything inferior. He'd point to the animals. He'd say, look, the lion in Africa is huge and fierce. The puma in America is smaller and cowardly. Therefore, the American climate shrinks and weakens all living things.
That is an astonishing leap of logic.
And he applied this directly to humans. He argued that Native Americans were physically weaker, intellectually sterile, and culturally stagnant because the land itself was immature and waterlogged.
So it's a form of environmental determinism, but a really twisted one.
Exactly. And if a traveler came back from Mexico and said, actually, I saw these incredible pyramids and a massive stone city in Peru, De Pauw would literally say, you're lying or you're mistaken because my theory says they're incapable of building cities.
Wow. He was gaslighting an entire hemisphere from his desk.
He was, and this is what Carli could not stand. Carli was a man of evidence. He read the actual accounts of travelers like La Condamine. He read the works of Francisco Javier Clavijero.
Who was Clavijero?
Clavijero was a Jesuit priest who had actually lived in Mexico for decades. He was exiled to Italy after the Jesuits were suppressed, and he was writing these incredible books basically screaming, I lived there, I saw it with my own eyes, you Europeans in your fancy libraries have no idea what you're talking about.
The voice of experience.
Yes. And Carli read Claviero and realized that de Pauw was a fraud. So the American letters became, in large part, a takedown piece.
I love a good academic takedown. How did Carli go about dismantling Pauw?
Point by point, methodically. First, military valor. De Pauw had said the Americans were cowards who just rolled over for the Spanish.
Which is obviously not what happened.
Not at all. Carli looked at the actual battle records of the conquistadors. He described the Aztec resistance at Tenochtitlan. He compared their bravery to the ancient Persians fighting King Darius.
He's using a classical reference. That's the highest compliment you can give in the 18th century, right?
Mm-hmm.
Comparing someone to the Greeks or Persians.
It was the absolute gold standard. He was saying, these aren't savages, these are heroes in the classical mold. Then he moved on to social structure. And Carli was completely obsessed with the Incas.
The Incas in Peru.
Yes. He looked at the Incan Empire, how they managed food distribution, how they cared for the elderly, their incredible road systems. He described it as a theocratic monarchy, sure, but he also called it a communist society.
Whoa. Communist is a very loaded word. What did he mean by that in the 1780s, before Marx?
He meant it in the sense of communal. He saw a society where private property wasn't the ultimate god, a society where the state guaranteed happiness and subsistence for every single person.
Okay.
He argued very provocatively that the average Incan subject was happier and more materially secure than the average French or Italian peasant. He was completely flipping the script.
So it's a sharp critique of European society disguised as history.
It is. He's saying, you call them savages? Maybe we should look in the mirror. They treat their poor better than we do.
Okay, so he's defended their bravery, their social structure. What's next?
Then he went for the kill. Technology and science.
And I'm guessing de Pauw's position was that they had no science.
De Pauw basically thought they couldn't count past 10. So Carli brought up the quipos.
The knotted strings, right?
Yes. The Incas didn't have written books like Europeans. They had these incredibly complex systems of knots on colored strings to record census data, historical events, astronomical information.
A completely different kind of literacy.
That's how Carli saw it. He was fascinated by this, and he actually drew a parallel between the Incan quipos and the ancient knotted ropes that were used in China for record keeping.
Wait, China? That's a long way from Peru.
It is. And this is the first real hint of Carli's bigger theory starting to form. He starts seeing these potential global connections. He suggests that maybe this isn't a coincidence, maybe there's a universal system or an ancient link between Asia and the Americas.
And he didn't stop there. He also talked about their skills, right?
Oh, yeah. He pointed out that it was the Americans who taught Europeans better techniques for stonework and for creating certain kinds of fabric dyes. It wasn't a one-way street of knowledge.
But the biggest flex has to be astronomy, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a debate that's going to involve an astronomer like Bailly, and you're arguing against a geographer like de Pauw, you have to talk about the stars.
And Carli did. He dove deep into the Mayan and Aztec calendars, the long count cycle. He analyzed their calculations for the length of the solar year and the lunar cycles, and he found something absolutely undeniable.
What was it?
The calculations used by the Mesoamericans to make corrections for the motion of the sun were more precise than the calendars of ancient Greece.
So he's saying the Aztecs were better astronomers than Aristotle.
That's exactly what he's saying. And in the Enlightenment, astronomy was the ultimate measuring stick of civilization. It was the queen of the sciences. If you had good astronomy, you were civilized. Full stop.
So by proving their math was better than the Greeks, Carli was essentially saying de Pauw's entire theory of degeneracy was racist garbage.
He completely demolished it. He established that these were brilliant, organized, culturally advanced people.
But that creates a new problem for him, doesn't it?
It does.
If they are so advanced and they have these strange similarities to China and Egypt, how on earth did they get there?
And that leads us directly to the Atlantic connection. Carli starts looking for analogies everywhere, trying to prove contact between the Old World and the New World.
What kind of analogies?
Customs, religion, the use of hieroglyphs, pyramid building.
Yeah.
But he also gets into linguistics.
Linguistics.
Mhm.
In the 1780s, I feel like that science was barely in its infancy. What kind of words are we talking about here?
You have to take this with a massive grain of salt, of course, but Carli became fixated on the phonetic root ATL.
ATL.
Right. He looked at the Greek Atlas and Atlantis. Then he looked at the Aztec language, Nahuatl.
Okay, I see Adel in Nahuatl. It's right there at the end of the word.
And he found place names like Aztlan, which was the legendary homeland of the Aztec people. To him, that phonetic overlap was a smoking gun. He asked, Why would people separated by a massive ocean use the same sound for their origin myths?
I mean, the obvious answer is coincidence. There are only so many sounds the human mouth can make.
To a modern skeptic, sure. But Carli combined this with the myths themselves. He cited Aztec traditions that said their ancestors came from a land far in the east, across the water.
Okay.
He even pointed out that when the Spanish first arrived, Emperor Montezuma initially thought they might be the descendants of these ancestors, returning home as prophesied.
So Carli puts it all together. The root words, the myths, the pyramids, the advanced astronomy, and he concludes there must have been a bridge.
More than a bridge, a whole continent. Carli was a traditionalist in this sense. He believed Plato's account was literally correct.
So not a metaphor, a real place.
A real place. He argued that a massive landmass once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, stretching from roughly 40 degrees north latitude to 40 degrees south.
Whoa, hold on. 40 north to 40 south? That's huge. That's from the latitude of New York City down to Argentina.
It's an absolutely enormous continent, yes. A landmass that would have allowed for easy migration and communication between what we now call the Old World and the New.
And what happened to it? Where did it go?
He believed that the islands we see in the Atlantic today, the Canary Islands, the Azores, Cape Verde, those are just the mountain peaks of Atlantis that didn't sink.
Okay, but you can't just have a continent the size of the Atlantic Ocean vanish into thin air. He must have had a theory for its destruction.
He did. This is where we get to the mechanism, and this is where Carli gets really inventive with the science of his day. He needed a catastrophe big enough to sink a continent.
An earthquake isn't going to do it.
No. So he blamed a comet.
A comet, of course. It's always a comet.
Well, you have to understand, comets were the wild cards of 18th century physics. They knew they existed, they knew they moved incredibly fast, but they didn't really know what they were made of or what would happen if one got too close. They were forces of cosmic chaos.
So what was his theory? Did the comet hit the Earth?
Not a direct impact. He proposed that roughly 6,600 years ago, a massive comet passed extremely close to the Earth. So close that its gravity wreaked havoc.
And what does a gravitational flyby like that do? Does it just cause big waves?
According to Carli, it fundamentally changed the mechanics of the entire planet. He painted a picture of the pre-comet Earth, a sort of paradise.
Okay.
He argued that before the disaster, the Earth was actually closer to the sun. It had no eccentricity in its orbit and a different axial tilt, so no seasons, just eternal spring all year round.
Global paradise.
And crucially, he said the year was exactly 360 days long.
360 days. That sounds oddly convenient, like the number of degrees in a circle.
That's his entire point. He said it explains why the circle has 360 degrees. It explains why so many ancient calendars from Egypt to Babylon to China originally seemed to have 360-day years, and then they all had to awkwardly add 5 intercalary or unlucky days later on.
So his argument is they weren't wrong. They were just remembering the old orbit.
Exactly. He said their ancient science is a memory of a different sky.
That is actually a very clever, very elegant theory.
It is. It connects all these disparate cultural facts. But then the comet swings by. Gravity grabs the Earth. It yanks the planet into a new, wider orbit, which is why we now have 365 days.
And it does something else.
It physically tilts the axis of the planet.
So the North Pole shifts.
Abruptly. And think about inertia. If you're running with a shallow pan of water and you suddenly stop or turn, what happens to the water?
It sloshes violently over the side.
Precisely. Carli argued that when the Earth's axis shifted, the solid crust of the planet moved, but the vast liquid oceans kept going for a moment. The water sloshed out of its basin.
The biblical flood.
This was the universal flood. It wasn't 40 days of rain. It was the Atlantic Ocean jumping out of its bed and drowning the entire continent of Atlantis in a single catastrophic event.
And his proof for this was what? Beyond the myths.
Geological proof. He pointed to the widespread discovery of marine fossils seashells, ancient fish found on the tops of high mountains in the Alps and the Apennines.
Right.
To Carli, that was absolute, undeniable proof. Look, he'd say, there are seashells up here. The water must have covered these mountains.
I mean, from his perspective, without knowing about plate tectonics pushing the seabed up over millions of years, the water went up. Is a perfectly logical conclusion.
It was the only logical conclusion available to him. It fit the evidence he had.
But hold on. A comet getting that close to the Earth? What are the odds? Did he even try to address the probability of an event like that?
He did, and it's one of the best, most witty parts of his entire argument. There was a bit of a comet panic in France around that time.
Comet panic.
Yeah, an astronomer named Lalande had published calculations on the probability of a comet collision, and the number was something like 1 in 76,000. People in Paris were freaking out.
1 in 76,000 doesn't actually sound that comforting, to be honest.
No, it doesn't. Another astronomer named Dusséjour tried to calm everyone down by recalculating it to something like 1 in 758,000. But Carli looked at these huge numbers and just laughed.
Laugh.
He compared it to playing the lottery, specifically the Italian Terna at the Lotto. The odds of winning that were about 1 in 11,748.
Okay, much better odds than a comet strike, but still very...
Yes. Exactly. He said, we don't look at the lottery winner and say, that's mathematically impossible. We say, well, someone had to win eventually. So a comet causing a catastrophe. It's a cosmic lottery. And 6,600 years ago, our ticket came up.
That is a surprisingly modern way to think about risk and probability. We are still terrible at intuitively understanding low probability, high impact events.
It's a fantastic argument. So there you have it. Carli has his grand, unified theory. A glorious Atlantic civilization, a hub connecting the hemispheres, destroyed by a cosmic event, leaving behind survivors in both America and the Old World who carried with them a fragmented memory of the past.
It connects geology, history, linguistics, astronomy. It's neat, it's tidy.
It's a beautiful story.
But it wasn't the only story in town.
Not even close. And now we have to turn to our other intellectual giant, to Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the astronomer.
Man who looked at the exact same world, the same myths, the same science, and saw something completely different.
That's right. Bailly reads the myths, he studies the stars, he looks at the geological evidence, and he concludes, Atlantis wasn't in the Atlantic, it was in the Arctic.
I'm sorry, I still can't get past this. Spitsbergen. The place where they keep the global seed vault because it's a permanent, stable, natural freezer. He thought that was the cradle of civilization.
He did. And to understand why, you have to understand the dominant theory of Earth's formation at the time, which came from the great naturalist, the Comte de Buffon.
Buffon, he was the big cheese in natural history, right?
The biggest. Buffon had proposed that the Earth didn't just form out of cold dust. He theorized it began as a molten blob of solar material that was literally ejected from the sun after being struck by a comet.
Okay, so the Earth starts as a ball of lava. I'm with you so far.
Right. Now, a simple physics question for you. If you have a burning hot sphere floating in the cold vacuum of space, where does it cool down first?
The outside surface, I guess?
Yeah.
The parts furthest from the hot core.
Yes, but specifically which parts of the surface? The poles. The regions receiving the least amount of direct solar energy are the first places to cool down enough to be habitable.
Oh, I see the logic now.
Buffon and Bailly argued that for thousands, maybe millions of years, the equator was still an uninhabitable sea of fire. But the North Pole. The North Pole would have been a balmy, temperate, tropical 75 degrees Fahrenheit.
So if the planet is cooling from the poles inward, the poles are the first Goldilocks zone.
Precisely. Bailly argued that life, and therefore human civilization, must have evolved at the poles first. It was the only place you could live. So Atlantis, this advanced ancient civilization developed in Spitsbergen when it was a tropical paradise.
And then the Earth kept cooling down.
Exactly. The global winter finally set in, the ice caps we know today began to form, and the Atlanteans, the proto-scientists, were forced to migrate south.
Fleeing the coming ice age.
Right. They moved down into Asia, spreading their knowledge to the primitive peoples they encountered in India and China.
So this is his explanation for why civilization seems to come from the east. He thinks they were actually refugees from the north.
That's his entire thesis, and this is what led to a massive, very public intellectual beef with Voltaire.
The Voltaire.
The one and only. Voltaire was an old man at this point, but he was a huge fan of Indian culture. He believed India was the true cradle of civilization because their astronomical records, their Vedas, seemed incredibly ancient.
So Voltaire is Team India.
Very much so. He told Bailly, look to the Brahmins on the banks of the Ganges. They are the original scientists.
And what did Bailly say to that?
Bailly said, you're being tricked. Their science is a fable. He analyzed the Indian astronomical tables and found them strange. He said the Indians had formulas that worked, but they didn't seem to understand the deep theory why they worked.
Like a student who memorizes the answers for the test, but can't actually show their work.
That's the perfect analogy. He called their science and their myths fragments of a greater lost whole. He famously wrote, "A palace is not built by children."
Meaning what?
He believed the Indian myths were the product of a childish, primitive imagination. But true science, he argued, requires the mature, logical reason of an adult mind. And the only way the childish Indians could have such good math was if they inherited it from a grown-up civilization.
The Atlanteans.
The Arctic Atlanteans.
You know, there is a really uncomfortable, pretty ugly undertone to all of this. It sounds a lot like he's stripping the brown people of their own scientific achievements and giving all the credit to some mysterious, lost white civilization from the north.
Oh, it's absolutely Eurocentric. It is the direct intellectual ancestor of the ancient aliens theory.
Right. These indigenous people couldn't possibly have built these pyramids. It must have been someone else.
It's the exact same logic. Bailey couldn't or wouldn't accept that the Indians developed this sophisticated science themselves. He needed a master race of philosophers from the Arctic to have given it to them.
So how did Carli, our other guy, react to this theory? I imagine the economist who believed in Atlantis didn't much like this new polar theory.
Carli thought Bailey was completely insane, and he wrote very aggressively about him. He called Bailey a terrible magician.
A magician, not a scientist.
An illusionist. A charlatan. He said Bailey used alluring violence on the historical record.
Alluring violence. That is a fantastic phrase.
Yeah. Isn't it? It means he charmed you with beautiful language and brilliant prose while simultaneously violently twisting the facts to fit his preconceived notion.
The fixed idea.
There it is again. Carli accused Bailey of confirmation bias, of cherry-picking. He said, "You are taking every myth, every fable, every scrap of poetry from across the world and forcing it to point north, even when it clearly points east or west." He basically accused Bailey of creating a flood of confusion to hide his weak argument.
So we have two geniuses, both respected members of the Republic of Letters. One says all the evidence points to a sunken continent in the Atlantic destroyed by a comet. The other says all the same evidence points to a frozen island in the Arctic abandoned by migrants.
And both of them claim to be using science and reason.
Which brings us to the most important part of this deep dive, really, the methodology. How is it possible for two incredibly smart men to look at the same data and see two completely different realities?
It feels like they were playing by totally different rules, doesn't it?
It does.
And Bailey actually tried to write down the rules. He was very concerned with this question of proof. He proposed a specific methodology for arriving at historical truth.
Okay.
He said, first of all, that historical doubt must have limits. You cannot use mathematical proof for history. You can't prove Caesar crossed the Rubicon the way you prove that a triangle has 180 degrees.
That's fair. History is messy. People are messy.
So he proposed a three-step ladder to truth. Step 1, you gather and balance testimonies from different sources. Step 2, you weigh the probabilities of different events. And step 3, this is the tricky one, you compare fables and myths against each other to clarify them.
Step 3 sounds like a minefield, comparing fables.
That's the trap. Bailey believed that if you strip away the magic and the superstition from a myth, the kernel that's left over must be a historical fact.
But who decides what counts as magic and what counts as history?
The historian does, the person with the theory.
So it's completely subjective.
It's a recipe for self-deception. And our source, Elio Antonello, draws a direct, unbroken line from Bailey's 18th century methodological mess to a modern field of science, archaeoastronomy.
Archaeoastronomy, that's the study of things like Stonehenge alignments.
Exactly. Looking at how ancient structures align with the sun, moon, and stars. And on the surface, it sounds like hard science, doesn't it? You measure the stones, you use a computer to calculate the exact position of the sun in 2000 BC, and you see if they line up. It's just math.
If it fits, it fits. Simple as that.
But does it? Antonello brings up what modern researchers call the problem of intentionality. He cites a modern astronomer named Bradley Schaefer who came up with a very strict set of criteria for this precisely because it's so easy to fool yourself.
How do you fool yourself with a bunch of rocks and math?
Okay, look at the window in this studio right now. It faces, what, roughly southeast?
Roughly, yeah.
If 1,000 years from now, an archaeologist unearths the ruins of this building, and he runs a computer model and discovers that on the exact day of the winter solstice, the rising sun shines perfectly through that window and illuminates that microphone. Does that mean we built this studio to worship the sun?
No. We built it here because the rent was cheap and the acoustics were good.
Exactly. That is the ambiguity trap. Just because something aligns mathematically doesn't prove the builders intended it to. It could be a complete coincidence.
So what do you need to prove intent?
Shaver's criteria say you need more than just the math. You need ethnographic evidence. You need archaeological evidence. You need to know if the culture that built the structure even cared about the winter solstice sunrise.
You need to know if we were sun worshippers before you assume the window is a temple.
Yes. And Bailey failed this test 1,000 times over. He saw alignments in the myths, references to long winter nights or the sun moving in a certain way across the sky, and he immediately assumed they intended to describe life in the Arctic. But he had no other proof. He just had a mathematical coincidence that he fell in love with.
And there it is again, the fixed idea.
It is. And Antonello connects this directly to psychology. He makes a fascinating reference to Sigmund Freud's psychopathology of everyday life, Freudian slips, forgetting names, the little glitches in our otherwise rational brains.
Right.
Antonello suggests we need to think about a psychopathology of everyday culture.
Meaning that an entire culture, or at least its intellectual class, can be mentally ill in a way.
In a way, yes. He argues that intellectuals, especially brilliant ones like Bailey, are prone to a specific kind of pathology. When they come up with a fixed idea, a grand theory of everything, they become like a lover. They become completely infatuated with it.
And love makes you blind.
Intellectual love makes you blind to counter evidence. Bailey wasn't lying. He wasn't a con man or a fraud. He was, in a sense, hallucinating. He was so smart that he could rationalize anything. If a fact didn't fit his Arctic theory, he would invent an incredibly complex, brilliant reason why it actually did fit, if you just looked at it sideways through 3 different filters.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Because it means being smart doesn't protect you from being wrong. And in fact, being smart might make you better at being wrong because you're so much better at arguing for your own delusion.
That is exactly the point. And Antonello points out that in the 18th century, they at least had the Republic of Letters to act as a check. Carli, the economist, could call out Bailey, the astronomer. They were in dialogue.
But today, we're all in our silos.
Today, we are so siloed. The archaeoastronomers talk to themselves. The historians talk to themselves. The physicists talk to themselves. There is often no one from the outside to step in and say, hey, hold on a minute. This sounds like a beautiful romance, but it doesn't sound like science.
So how does this all end for our 2 combatants? The economist of the Atlantic versus the astronomer of the Arctic.
Well, Carli has a relatively quiet ending. He continued to write, he was respected, and he died in 1795, remembered as a great man of culture. But Bailey's ending is an absolute tragedy.
The French Revolution.
Yes. Bailey wasn't just a reclusive astronomer in an ivory tower. He was a true believer in the Enlightenment. He wanted to bring reason and order to French society. He was actually elected the first president of the National Assembly. He became the mayor of Paris.
He's right in the thick of it from the very beginning.
He administered the tennis court oath. He was a central figure. But revolutions, like comets, are chaotic and unpredictable. The political tide turned. The radical Jacobins took over.
And they didn't want reason and order.
They wanted blood and ideological purity. Bailey was seen as too moderate, too much a part of the old establishment he had helped to tear down. He was arrested during the Reign of Terror.
The man who believed that historical doubt must have limits, he ran out of luck.
In November of 1793, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the man who tried to mathematically prove the location of Eden, the man who argued that civilization was a triumph of order over chaos, was dragged to the guillotine and executed.
That is just heavy. He was killed by the machine of the very revolution he helped to start.
It's the ultimate brutal irony. He thought the world was a rational, predictable place, governed by laws as clear as physics. He found out the hard way that human history is messy, violent, and utterly unforgiving.
So we've covered comets, cooling Earths, Inca communism, academic feuds, and the guillotine. What is the final takeaway here for the person listening to this on their commute? Why does this 240-year-old Atlantis war matter?
I think it matters because it's a profound lesson in intellectual humility. It's so easy for us to look back at Carli and Bailly and laugh. Ha ha, they thought Atlantis was in the Arctic. Ha ha, they thought a comet changed the length of the year.
We feel so superior because we have Wikipedia and plate tectonics and carbon dating.
Right. But we are doing the exact same thing right now. We are constantly building grand narratives to explain our world. We look at the past and we project our own values, our own obsessions onto it.
We find what we're looking for.
Always. Carli was an economist from a commercial republic, so he found a noble, communal, well-administered society in the Incas and Atlantis. Bailly was a brilliant scientist who loved mathematical order, so he found a lost civilization of pure scientists as the origin of everything.
We see the past not as it was, but as we are.
We do. And that means we have to ask ourselves constantly, what is our Arctic theory?
What is the thing that we are so certain of today that people in the year 2226 will look back on and say, I can't believe they actually thought that was science?
That is the question. And unlike a comet, we can't calculate the odds of when we'll finally figure it out.
Something to mull over. Thank you so much for walking us through this. This was a wild, wild ride.
It was an absolute pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep your minds open, but maybe keep one eye on the comments. We'll see you in the next deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to step into a time machine. But we aren't going to the future, and we aren't going to look at dinosaurs. We are dropping ourselves right into the middle of the 18th century.
Okay, I'm with you.
And I want you to picture it. The Enlightenment. It's the age of powdered wigs, heavy coats, and, very serious men sitting in coffee houses in Paris and Milan discussing the nature of the universe.
It is the age of reason. That's the branding anyway. It's supposed to be the moment in history where humanity finally decides that science, logic, and rationality are going to sweep away all the old cobwebs of superstition.
Right. But here's the catch. We have this stack of sources today centered around an analysis by Elio Antonello, and it tells a very different story.
It really does.
It turns out that right in the middle of this age of reason, some of the smartest people in Europe, we were talking about the Elon Musks and the Neil deGrasse Tysons of the 1700s, got involved in a massive, heated intellectual street fight about Atlantis.
It really is one of the most fascinating contradictions of that era. You have these members of the Academy of Sciences, famous astronomers, rigorous economists, people who practically invented the scientific method, spending years of their lives debating the existence of a lost continent.
And not just its existence, but where it was.
Oh, the location is everything. They're also debating comets smashing into the Earth and whether civilization actually started in the freezing Arctic. It gets pretty wild.
And the source we are digging into, Antonello's paper, Atlantis, Carli and Bailly, it frames this not just as a quirky historical footnote, but as a psychological study.
Yeah, that's the core of it.
It's a cage match between two titans, Gian Rinaldo Carli and Jean-Sylvain Bailly. And honestly, the language they use is incredible. We're talking about alluring violence, romance disguised as science, and a 200-year-old lesson on why smart people fall for bad ideas.
And the mission for us today is to unpack this debate. We want to understand how the search for the origins of civilization led these brilliant minds into some very serious traps.
Traps that, if we are being honest, we still fall into today.
Oh, absolutely. The psychology hasn't changed a bit.
So let's introduce the cast of characters. In the red corner, we have Gian Rinaldo Carli. Who was this guy?
Carli was a heavyweight intellectual from the Venetian Republic. He was born in Capodistria, which is Koper in modern-day Slovenia, but he made his career in Milan.
Okay, so what was his field? History, archaeology.
That's the interesting part. He wasn't an archaeologist or historian by trade. He was an economist. He was an expert in finance, coinage, and public economy.
So he's a numbers guy. A pragmatic dollars and cents kind of thinker?
Extremely practical. He spent his life dealing with the hard realities of government budgets, inflation, that sort of thing. But like many men of the Enlightenment, he was a polymath. He had an insatiable curiosity.
So he didn't just stick to his lane.
Not at all. So when he retired, he didn't just sit on a porch. He wrote a massive multi-volume work called Lettere Americane, or American Letters. And that's where this all begins.
And in the blue corner, we have his opponent, Jean-Sylvain Bailly.
Bailly is a tragic superstar. In the 1770s and 80s, he was arguably one of the most famous scientists in France. He was an astronomer, a mathematician, and a high-ranking member of the Academy of Sciences.
So a very serious, very credentialed figure.
Totally. He was famous for his work on the satellites of Jupiter, very rigorous stuff. Later on, he actually became the first mayor of Paris during the French Revolution.
That sounds like a job with a low survival rate.
It was fatal. He was eventually guillotined in 1793 during the Reign of Terror. But before he lost his head to the guillotine, he kind of lost his head to a theory about the origins of the world.
And we have a special guest star hovering over this whole debate, right?
We do. The one and only Voltaire, the famous philosopher. He appears in our story as a sort of skeptical pen pal to Bailey.
So he's the one asking the tough questions.
Exactly. He plays the role of the grumpy old man trying to poke holes in Bailey's wild theories, asking the questions that no one else wanted to ask, but in a very polite, almost sarcastic way.
Okay, so we have an Italian economist, a French astronomer, and Voltaire. The core conflict is about Atlantis, but it doesn't start there, does it? It starts with a fight about the Americas.
This is crucial context. To understand why Carli, this practical economist, cared about lost continents, you have to understand the American dispute of the 18th century.
The American dispute, what was that?
There was a very fashionable, very arrogant view in Europe at the time, led by a Dutch geographer named Cornelius de Pauw.
And what was de Pauw claiming?
De Pauw, who, we should note, had never set foot in the Americas.
Of course not.
Never. He claimed that the New World was biologically and culturally inferior to Europe. He argued that the climate and geography of America caused degeneration.
Degeneration. What does that even mean?
He said the animals were smaller, the dogs didn't bark, and the people, the Native Americans, were barbarians or savages who were physically and mentally less capable than Europeans.
That is, well, obviously racist, but also just scientifically lazy. He never even went there.
Never. He sat in his study in Europe and decided that everything across the Atlantic was rotten. He rejected observations from people who had actually been there. And this drove Carli crazy. Carli's book, American Letters, was a direct counterattack. He wanted to defend the honor of the Americas.
So he wasn't looking for Atlantis initially. He was just trying to set the record straight about Native American civilizations.
That was the spark. And he had a secret weapon, didn't he?
He did. He relied on the testimony of Francisco Javier Clavijero.
Right. Who was he?
Clavijero was a Jesuit priest born in Mexico. He had lived there. He knew the culture. He knew the history. He spoke the languages.
So he was a primary source.
The ultimate primary source.
Yeah.
When the Jesuits were expelled and he came to Italy, he read what Europeans like Pauw and others were writing, and he was appalled.
Mm-hmm.
He realized the vast extent of European ignorance. So he decided to write the true history of Mexico to refute them all.
And Carli takes Clavijero's firsthand knowledge and just weaponizes it against Pauw. He becomes the defense attorney for pre-Columbian civilization.
So what kind of evidence did he use? How did he make his case?
He went into incredible detail. He didn't just say they're civilized. He used comparative history, which was a very Enlightenment thing to do.
He compared them to cultures the Europeans already respected.
Precisely. Take warfare, for example. De Pauw called the Aztecs savages. Carli looked at the accounts of the battles between the Aztecs and the Spanish. He compared the Aztec valor and strategy to the ancient Persians fighting against King Darius.
He's using the Europeans' own heroes against them. He's saying, you love the Persians, you think they're the height of ancient martial prowess, while the Aztecs are just as brave.
Exactly. And then he looked at their society. This is one of the most interesting parts of his analysis, especially for an economist. He looked at the Inca Empire in Peru.
What did he see there?
He described it as a happy theocratic monarchy that ruled over a sort of communist society.
Communist in the 1700s. That's an anachronism, isn't it?
He didn't mean it in the Marxist sense we think of today. He meant communal. He was deeply impressed by the way the Inca state provided for its people. They had welfare systems, huge storehouses to prevent famine, and strict laws that protected the common person.
So for an economist like Carli, this wasn't savagery. This was highly advanced public administration.
It was a well-oiled machine. And he brought up technology, too.
Right.
He pointed out a glaring logical fallacy in De Pauw's argument. The Native Americans actually taught the Europeans things.
Which wouldn't make sense if they were the inferior people.
Not at all. They taught Europeans specific stonework techniques, better methods for dyeing fabrics, new agricultural practices. Carli basically asks, if they are the inferior species, why are they teaching the superior Europeans new technology? It's a simple, devastating point.
One of the specific things he mentions is the quipos.
Yes, the quipos. Those are the knotted ropes the Incas used to store data.
Which most Europeans probably just dismissed as primitive trinkets.
Exactly. They saw them as primitive toys. But Carli, being a numbers guy, looked closer. He drew a direct analogy between the Inca quipos and the knotted ropes used in ancient China for their numerical systems.
So he's starting to build a bridge here. He's seeing patterns that connect these distant worlds.
He's connecting the dots. And the final dot The one that really sends him down the rabbit hole was their astronomy.
That was his ace in the hole.
Completely. Carli asserted that American knowledge of astronomy was fully equal to that of the ancient Greeks. And in some specific cases, like the small corrections needed for the motion of the sun and moon, he argued the Americans were actually more advanced than the Greeks.
Okay, so Carli has established, pretty convincingly, that the Native Americans are sophisticated, civilized, and brilliant astronomers.
Hmm.
But here is where the deep dive takes a sharp turn.
It really does.
He doesn't just stop at, hey, these guys are smart. He pivots to, how did they get so smart?
This is the jump. This is where we go from the defense of a people to the search for Atlantis. Carli looked at all the similarities, the customs, the religion, the hieroglyphs, the astronomy between the Old World, Egypt and Europe, and the New World, the Americas.
And he decided these similarities were too close to be a coincidence.
Way too close.
Yeah.
He completely rejected the idea that they could have invented these things independently. For him, that was statistically impossible. He concluded that in a remote epoch, there must have been communication between the two hemispheres.
So now he needs to find the link, the source of this shared culture.
And he starts pulling in evidence from everywhere. He starts with linguistic evidence. This is a big one for him.
What did he find?
He compares the name Atlas from Greek mythology and the name Atlantis with the Aztec root Atlan.
Atlan, A-T-L-A-N.
Yes, and he points out that this root appears in the names of so many Aztec towns. Their legendary homeland was Aztlan. You see it everywhere. For Carli, that's not a coincidence. That's a linguistic fossil.
And the oral traditions, did he use those?
Oh, he cites them heavily. He points out that Aztec traditions spoke of their ancestors leaving Mexico to travel east out into the Atlantic.
Okay.
And on the flip side, ancient European and African writers like Plato described a massive continent to the west. So you have one group saying our ancestors went east and the other group saying there's a lost land to the west.
Stories match up.
They match up. And he even uses the famous story of Montezuma.
When Cortez arrived in Mexico.
Right. Montezuma famously thought the arriving Spaniards might be the descendants of his ancient ancestors returning home from the east. For Carli, this was the final proof. The Americans remembered sending people east. The Europeans remembered a land to the west. The puzzle pieces fit perfectly.
So if you have people in America and people in Africa and Europe with shared roots, there must have been a bridge.
And that bridge was the continent of Atlantis. Carli proposed a massive landmass that existed in the Atlantic Ocean. He estimated it stretched roughly from 40 degrees north latitude to 40 degrees south.
That is massive. That's not an island. That is filling the entire ocean from Spain to the Caribbean.
It is. He believed that the islands we see today, the Azores, the Canaries, Cape Verde, are merely the mountaintops of this lost land. They are the highest peaks that stayed above water when the rest of it sank.
Wow. Okay, so how did he date this civilization? Because obviously the Americans didn't have iron tools or money when the Europeans arrived.
That was his key chronological marker. He was working backwards. Since Native Americans didn't use iron or coins, Carli deduced that the separation between the continents, the cataclysm, must have happened before those things were invented in the Old World.
That's actually a pretty clever piece of reasoning.
It is. He then did some very heavy lifting with cosmic cycles, comparing Egyptian, Babylonian, and Chinese astronomical records. And he estimated the epoch of Atlantis was about 6,600 years prior to his time.
Okay, so we have a giant continent in the Atlantic 6,600 years ago, but obviously it isn't there anymore. So how did Carli, the economist, explain the disappearance of an entire continent?
This is where we get into the blockbuster movie territory. Carli proposed a cosmic catastrophe. He believed Atlantis was destroyed by a collision between the Earth and a large comet.
A comet collision. In the 1700s, that seems pretty out there for the time.
It was actually a very hot topic. We call it cometary catastrophism. And Carli didn't just say, boom, a comet hit. He described the physics of the pre-collision Earth in detail.
What did he think it was like?
He believed that before this impact, the Earth was closer to the sun. The year was exactly 360 days long.
Which would explain why circles have 360 degrees in so many ancient cultures. He's tying it all together.
He's tying everything together. He also thought the Earth had zero orbital eccentricity. It was a perfect circle, and the axis had a different inclination. It was a world of basically eternal spring. A paradise.
And then the comet hits.
The impact causes abrupt dynamical changes. The axis tilts, giving us seasons. The orbit stretches out, giving us the extra 5 days in the year.
And the continent.
Most importantly, the impact causes a massive redistribution of ocean waters. The water sloshes over the land, drowning Atlantis, and, in his mind, explaining why we find marine fossils on mountaintops.
I love that detail. Why are there seashells on the Alps? Because a comet hit the ocean and splashed water everywhere. It's a grand unified theory of everything.
It was a catastrophic theory of geology. And we have to remember the context. People were genuinely terrified of comets in the late 1700s.
Really?
Oh, yeah. In 1773, the astronomer Lalande published a paper about comets that could approach Earth, and it caused mass panic in France. People thought the apocalypse was coming, priests were selling out of indulgences, it was a whole thing.
So Carli was tapping into a real existing fear.
He was. And being the math guy, he actually calculated the odds, didn't he?
He did. He loved the statistics. He cited another astronomer, a guy named Dusséjour, who calculated the probability of a direct comet hit as 1 in 758,730.
Those sound like pretty good odds for us. 1 in over 750,000, I'd take that.
Right.
But Carli had this brilliant rebuttal. He compared it to the lottery. He said the odds of winning the Turna at the lotto were 1 in 11,748.
Much more likely than a comet.
Yes, but his point was, sure, the odds are low, but people win the lottery every week. It happens indeed. He's saying that rare events are not impossible events.
That is such a great line of reasoning. Unlikely things happen all the time.
Yeah.
So in Carli's final narrative, you have this King Atlas of Atlantis. He invents astronomy in this paradise.
Yeah.
And then he diffuses it. He spreads it east to Europe and Africa and west to America. It's a cultural colonization.
Exactly. And Carli makes a very specific point. He notes that the tradition of Atlantis exists in Europe, Africa, and America, but it is absent in Asian cultures. This is a crucial detail.
Why is that so important?
Because it sets up his big fight with our next character, Jean-Sylvain Bailly.
Right. Let's bring Bailly into the ring. Because while Carli is looking west to the Atlantic, Bailly is looking north.
It's extremely north. Bailly completely rejected the Atlantic location. He thought Carli had it all wrong. He placed Atlantis in the Arctic.
In the Arctic.
Specifically, the island of Spitsbergen, way up in the Svalbard archipelago.
Okay, hold on. Spitsbergen. It's freezing there. It's ice and polar bears. It's one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Why would a famous astronomer think the cradle of civilization was in the Arctic?
Because of physics, or rather, a very specific and popular theory of physics from that time proposed by the Comte de Buffon.
Buffon, another big name.
A giant. Buffon was a naturalist who had this theory about the Earth's evolution called the epochs of nature. He believed the Earth began as a hot sphere of solar material.
So like a molten ball that got flung off the
And
sun.
that was the idea, a giant, glowing, molten ball. Now, if you have a hot ball flying through cold space,
It cools down.
it cools down. And where does a sphere cool down first?
A surface, I guess, the outer layer.
Even more specifically, the poles. Buffon argued that the Earth cooled from the poles downward toward the equator. So logically, there must have been a period in Earth's history, a kind of Goldilocks window,
Ah, I see where this is going.
where the equator was still boiling hot magma, but the North Pole had cooled just enough to be a pleasant, temperate paradise.
So Bailly looked at this cooling model and said, the first habitable real estate on Earth wasn't the Fertile Crescent, it was the Arctic.
Exactly. He argued Spitsbergen was the antediluvian cradle. The first humans lived there because everywhere else on the planet was still too hot to support life. Therefore, astronomy, science, and all of civilization must have been invented there by these Arctic Atlanteans.
That is certainly a creative interpretation of the data. I'll give him that. But he had a huge problem, didn't he?
A massive one.
Because everyone in the 18th century pretty much agreed that civilization came from Asia, from India or China.
Right. The prevailing view was ex oriente lux. Light comes from the east. India was seen as the ancient cradle of wisdom and science. Bailly had to somehow prove that astronomy moved from the Arctic to Asia,
How on earth do you prove that?
by essentially discrediting the Indians. He argued that the ancient Indian astronomical writings, the Vedas and so on, were just fables or myths.
So he's saying they didn't really know what they were talking about.
That's the core of it. He claimed they possessed these incredibly complex and accurate astronomical numbers, but they didn't seem to understand the underlying science. The explanations attached to the numbers were all mythological nonsense, in his view.
So he thought they were just repeating stuff they had memorized without comprehension.
Precisely. He called it a child mentality, and he actually wrote to Voltaire to try and convince him of this.
Oh, this should be good.
It's fantastic. He wrote to Voltaire and said, "A palace is not built by children." His argument was, the Indians have these scraps of genius knowledge, but they are mixed in with all this fables and folklore. Therefore, they couldn't have invented it themselves.
They must have inherited it.
They must have inherited it from a superior, older culture that died out or moved away. The brilliant, scientific people from the Arctic, the Spitsbergen Atlanteans.
And what did Voltaire think about this? I imagine the great skeptic had some thoughts.
Voltaire played it very coy. He wrote back, playing the part of the humble student, the old blind man asking for help, as he put it.
Very clever.
He asked, why couldn't the Brahmins in India have invented astronomy themselves? They have a beautiful climate, they have clear skies, and they needed astronomy for their agriculture. It's a very practical, common sense objection.
It makes perfect sense. If you are a farmer in India, you need to know when the monsoon is coming. You look at the stars. It's a practical need.
Bailey wouldn't have it. He doubled down. He told Voltaire that need does not invent the arts. He was a romantic in that sense. He stuck to this idea that the childlike state of the early Asian populations meant they were incapable of rigorous science. Only the lost masters of the North could have done it.
This brings us to a really important part of the source material. Voltaire pushes back again. He asks, is it really permitted to just doubt the existence of the people who actually live there and invent a lost people instead?
And this is where Bailey gives this fascinating defense of what we might call soft science.
Right. This is a critical moment in the history of the scientific method.
It really is. Bailey admits to Voltaire, not all truths can be demonstrated like mathematical truths. He says that doubt has its limits. If we only accepted things we could prove, like 2 + 2 = 4, humanity would lose too much knowledge from history and the arts.
So what's his alternative method for finding truth?
He proposes a method of using balanced testimonies and weighted probabilities.
What does that mean?
He says if you take enough fables, enough myths, enough fragments of ancient knowledge from different cultures and you compare them, they start to create a strong light that can lead to evidence.
He's basically saying if I pile up enough maybes, eventually they turn into a definitely.
That is the perfect way to put it. It's confirmation bias codified as a methodology. And this is where Carli, our economist friend from Milan, steps back into the ring to absolutely demolish Bailey.
I love this part of the story. Carli doesn't just disagree with Bailey. He gets personal. He calls him a magician.
A terrible magician, yes. Carli admires Bailey's skill as a writer, but he accuses him of using alluring violence on the reader.
Alluring violence. That is such a poetic way to say he's gaslighting us with beautiful prose.
It really is. Carli is saying that Bailey writes so beautifully and weaves these disparate facts together so skillfully that he forces you to believe a lie. He hypnotizes you.
But Carli goes even further than that. He claims Bailey knows he's lying.
He does. He thinks Bailey is an intellectual fraud.
A fraud in what sense? Not like a con artist trying to make money?
No, not at all. An intellectual fraud. Carli believes that Bailey knows deep down that the Atlantis story from Plato points to the Atlantic. The evidence from the ancients is just too clear.
So why would he move it to the Arctic?
Because Bailey was so committed to his science from the North theory, so committed to Buffon's cooling Earth model, that he had to move Atlantis to the Arctic to make the physics work. The cradle of civilization had to be at the pole.
So he twisted the history to fit the physics.
Exactly. He privileged his physical model over the historical and textual evidence, and Carli found the smoking gun for this.
The smoking gun.
He quotes a letter Bailey wrote to Voltaire. In the letter, Bailey writes, "If you order me to reconcile Plato with Plutarch and to make you a romance, I can obey you."
Make you a romance. That's the key word there.
Carli seized on that. A romance in those days meant a fiction, a novel, a fanciful story. So Carli points to this and says, see, he admits it himself. This whole Arctic theory isn't a scientific essay, it's a romance. It's fairy tale he invented to please his mentor and fit his model.
That is a devastating critique. He's using Bailey's own words against him.
And it's amazing because today Bailey is remembered as this serious scientist and revolutionary mayor. But at the time, his contemporaries were pretty brutal about this theory.
They didn't all buy it.
Not by a long shot. D'Alembert and Condorcet, two other major intellectuals, mocked him behind his back. They called him a mystical buffoon.
Wow.
Even his friend Lalande, the astronomer who caused the comet panic, was frustrated with him. He complained that Bailey's work on fables was more curious than useful and that it didn't actually help the science of astronomy at all.
So he saw it as a distraction.
A total distraction. And Lalande noted that Bailey had fixed ideas. That's the direct quote. He said that once Bailey decided on a theory, you could not bring him back to the truth. His mind was made up.
Fixed ideas. That's a phrase that sticks. It sounds like confirmation bias on steroids.
It is, and that bridges us perfectly to the analysis by the author of our source, Elio Antonello. He pivots from this incredible 18th century drama to a problem we still have today in certain fields, the problem of demonstration.
Right. Antonello brings up cultural astronomy, or as it's often called, archaeoastronomy.
Yeah, that's the study of how ancient people understood the sky. Think Stonehenge and its alignment with the solstice. That's the classic example.
And Antonello argues that Bailey's problematic method, this idea of weighted probabilities and combining fables, is exactly what plagues archaeoastronomy today.
The core question, he says, is always this. How do you prove intentionality?
Unpack that for us. What do you mean by intentionality?
Okay, so you find an ancient temple in the jungle, and you're a modern researcher with a computer. You notice that one window lines up perfectly with the rising of the star Sirius on a specific date, say the start of the rainy season.
Okay, that seems significant.
It seems significant, but did the builders mean to do that, or is it just a coincidence? I mean, there are thousands of stars in the sky. A building has multiple walls and windows. The calendar has 365 days. Something is bound to line up with something eventually, just by pure chance.
So how do you prove they did it on purpose?
Yeah.
That it wasn't an accident?
That's the hard truth. And Antonello argues that rigorous statistical methods cannot prove human intention. Intentionality is outside the realm of the physical sciences.
So you can use math to measure the alignment, but you can't use math to measure the intent of the person who built it.
Exactly. The measurement is the hard science part. The conclusion about what it means is an anthropological or historical interpretation. It's a soft science conclusion.
He mentions a modern scholar, Schaeffer, who tried to create a set of criteria for this.
Yes. And Schaeffer's criteria sound very rigorous. He proposed you need 4 things to prove an astronomical alignment is real: statistical significance, archaeological evidence, ethnographic evidence like writings, or oral traditions that mention the star and astronomical utility.
So did it actually help them do something like plant their crops?
Right. It all sounds very solid. But Antonello points out that this is just a modern, more sophisticated version of Bailey's balanced testimonies and weighted probabilities.
It's still just piling up clues and hoping they add up to a definitive proof. You're still making a leap of faith from correlation to causation.
You are. Antonello warns that the public is often misled by this. We see someone measuring Stonehenge with lasers and GPS, and we think, oh, this is hard science, they're getting precise numbers.
But the conclusion?
The conclusion, they built this as a giant calendar to worship the sun god, is an interpretation. It's a compelling story, and it might even be true, but it's soft science wearing a hard science costume.
Just like Bailey using the hard science of Buffon's cooling earth physics to justify his soft science interpretation of myths about a northern paradise.
Precisely. He used the authority of physics to back up his historical fantasy. And this leads us to the final and perhaps most uncomfortable part of our deep dive today: the psychology of it all.
The psychology of why these brilliant people go down these paths. Antonello uses a phrase I love: the psychopathology of everyday culture.
It's a great phrase. It's a riff on Sigmund Freud's book, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life.
Right, where Freud talked about Freudian slips and how our little mistakes and memory lapses reveal our subconscious desires.
Exactly. Antonello suggests we have a similar pathology in our culture, in the way we build and defend ideas. He says we fall in love with ideas.
We fall in love with our own theories.
We do, and that love can blind us. Both Carli and Bailly were brilliant men. They were masters of logic in their own fields. But when it came to their pet theories, they both engaged in selective filtering.
They picked the proofs that fit their picture and ignored the ones that didn't.
Completely. Carli ignored the massive physical difficulties of a comet impact that could move that much water, because he needed the water to move to sink Atlantis. Bailly ignored the fact that Spitsbergen is a frozen wasteland because he needed his cooling theory to be true.
But the source makes a point of saying there's a difference between them, isn't there? Carli seemed to have a bit more self-awareness about what he was doing.
That's a very important distinction Antonello makes. Carli admitted in his letters that his work was a poem in prose, or a pastime. He knew on some level it was hypothetical. He was playing with ideas, almost like a mental exercise or a thought experiment. He wasn't dogmatic about it.
Whereas Bailey
Bailly believed it. He had those fixed ideas Lalonde talked about. He confused his romance with reality. And Antonello argues that today, many pseudo-historians and fringe theorists lack Carli's self-awareness. They are utterly convinced their ideas are absolute, undeniable fact.
It's that dangerous combination of intelligence and ego. You're smart enough to build a complex, internally consistent theory, but you're too in love with it to see where it's broken.
And in fields like cultural astronomy or history or politics or economics, where you can't just run a clean lab experiment to rigorously disprove something, this pathology thrives. We lose the ability to critique our own narratives because there's no hard stop sign from nature.
So if we look at the big picture of this whole journey today, we started with the debate about the sophistication of Native Americans. We went to a comet smashing the Atlantic Ocean, then to a Garden of Eden in the Arctic, then to a magician casting spells on his readers, and finally, to the limits of scientific proof itself.
It's a journey that shows us the desperate need for what Antonello calls interdisciplinary collaboration. True collaboration.
Meaning what?
Meaning if Bailly, the astronomer, had really listened to the historians and the linguists, or if Carli, the economist, had listened to geologists who were starting to think differently, maybe they wouldn't have gone so far off the rails. They needed people from other fields to check their illusions.
It's a lesson in intellectual humility. Even the smartest people in the room, the members of the Academy, the mayors of Paris, the mathematicians, can convince themselves of total nonsense if it fits their preferred model of the world.
Especially if it fits their model. That's the most seductive kind of nonsense, the kind that feels logical because it starts from a premise you already accept.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought. We look back at Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and we kind of laugh. Haha, what a buffoon. He thought the Garden of Eden was in the Arctic because he fell in love with a heat dissipation theory.
It seems absurd to us now, but we should ask ourselves, what is the modern equivalent?
Exactly. What fixed ideas are we currently holding on to? What grand, elegant theories has we constructed about history or politics or science just because they fit neatly into our preferred worldview?
If a certified genius like Bailly could trick himself into seeing Atlantis in the snow because it confirmed his bias, what are we tricking ourselves into seeing right now?
It raises the question, are we really looking for the truth, or are we all just writing our own romances just like he was?
A difficult question, but a necessary one.
Something to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Always a pleasure. Keep questioning.
I want you to close your eyes for a second. Well, don't close them if you're driving. But picture this. Atlantis. What's the very first image that pops into your head?
It's usually, white marble columns underwater, isn't it? Maybe some people in togas swimming around with gills.
Right, or Jason Momoa holding a trident. It's pop culture. It's the backdrop for comic books. It's the plot device for a summer blockbuster. And if we're being honest, it's the bread and butter of the New Age section of the bookstore.
Oh, absolutely. Right next to the crystal healing and the ancient alien stuff.
It is the definition of fringe. If you talk about Atlantis at a serious dinner party today, people sort of look at you like you just announced you're a flat earther.
They do. They give you that polite, slow nod and then change the subject.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. And this is the hook for today. It wasn't always a joke. If we rewind the tape about 250 years to the absolute height of the Enlightenment, Atlantis wasn't a fairy tale.
No, not at all. It was the center of a brutal, high-stakes intellectual cage match between some of the smartest people on the planet.
We are talking about the heavy hitters here, the people inventing modern astronomy, the people, running national economies.
These were titans, and for them, finding Atlantis wasn't about finding a cool underwater city. It was the theory of everything for the 18th century.
Yeah.
They believed if they could locate this lost continent, they could unlock the history of the human species, the evolution of the Earth, and the origins of civilization itself.
And the craziest part is that they weren't just arguing about if it existed. I mean, they took that as a given. They were arguing about where.
And the theories they came up with, well, one of them sounds surprisingly logical, and the other one is going to sound completely insane to modern ears.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into this specific intellectual battle. We're looking at a fascinating paper titled Atlantis, Carli and Bailly, and a short discussion about demonstration in cultural astronomy by Elio Antonello.
And the mission here is really twofold. First, we are going to explore this clash between Gian Rinaldo Carli and Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the skeptic versus the visionary. One thought Atlantis was in the Atlantic, the classic view.
The one we all kind of know.
Right. The other was absolutely convinced, would have bet his life on it, that Atlantis was in the Arctic, specifically Spitsbergen.
Spitsbergen, the place with the polar bears and the Svalbard Global Seed Vault.
The very same. But the second part of the mission is the one that really matters for us today.
Right.
We are going to use this 200-year-old debate as a mirror.
Okay.
Because this isn't just about lost continents. It's a case study on how we prove things, the limits of evidence, and frankly, how very, very smart people can fool themselves.
I love that. It's the smart person trap. Just because you're a genius mathematician doesn't mean you can't talk yourself into believing the Garden of Eden was on a glacier.
Precisely. And we're going to see just how deep that trap can be. So, let's set the stage. We have our two protagonists. In the red corner, we have Gian Rinaldo Carli. Paint the picture for us. Who was this guy?
Carli is such a fascinating character because he is so grounded. He was born in Capodistria, which was part of the Venetian Republic today. It's Koper in Slovenia. But he really made his mark in Milan.
Right, during the Milanese Enlightenment.
When I hear Enlightenment, I usually think of Paris and, philosophers in salons drinking wine. Was Milan different?
Oh, very different. Milan was under Austrian rule at the time, and the vibe was much more pragmatic. It was about infrastructure, taxes, public health, reform. Carli wasn't just an armchair philosopher, he was a man of action.
So not a theorist, a doer.
Exactly. In 1765, he was appointed chairman of public economy in Milan. He was a systems guy. He liked things that could be counted, measured, and verified.
He sounds like the kind of guy who would look at a myth and immediately ask, okay, but show me the receipts.
That is exactly his vibe. But, and this is the interesting twist, he had a creative soul. After he retired, he wrote the work we are focusing on today. Lettere Americane, or American Letters, published between 1780 and 1783.
Okay.
And despite his background in hard economics, he viewed this work as a pastime. He even called it a poem in prose.
A poem in prose feels like a weird description for a book by a retired economist. Was he just writing fiction?
No, and that's the trick. He wanted it to be colloquial. He didn't want to write a stiff academic textbook that only 5 people in a university library would ever read. He wanted to write something engaging, something people would discuss. But the content itself was incredibly rigorous comparative anthropology.
Okay, so that's Carli, the skeptic, the economist, the practical man with a poetic streak.
Oh.
Now, in the blue corner, we have Jean-Sylvain Bailly. And looking at his resume, this guy is intense.
Bailly is a superstar. If Carli is a respected government official, Bailly is a celebrity academic. He was a French astronomer and mathematician. We are talking about a member of the Academy of Sciences and the French Academy.
That's like the double crown of French intellect, right?
It's the EJOT of 18th century French science and letters. You couldn't get more prestigious.
So he starts out doing real science, telescopes and numbers.
Oh, absolutely. He started his career doing serious observational astronomy, looking through telescopes, calculating the orbits of Jupiter's moons, hard, verifiable data. But then he pivoted.
He pivoted hard.
He abandoned the telescope to focus on the history of astronomy. He became obsessed with the question, who figured all this out first? Where did it all begin?
And that search for the first astronomers led him down a bit of a rabbit hole.
A very deep one. He became convinced that there was an antediluvian culture, a civilization before the biblical flood that had perfected astronomy and then kick-started all other civilizations. He was looking for patient zero of human knowledge, the mother culture.
We should probably mention where his story ends because it adds this layer of, tragedy to everything we're about to discuss.
It really does. Bailly didn't stay in his ivory tower. He became a major political figure. He served as the first president of the National Assembly during the French Revolution and was elected mayor of Paris.
So he's one of the guys who started the revolution.
He was. But, as happened to so many moderates, the tide turned against him. He was guillotined in 1793. It's a sobering end for a man who spent his life searching for a lost paradise.
Wow. Okay, so we have an Italian economist and a French astronomer turned revolutionary. And they are arguing about the origins of civilization. Let's start with Carli. His book is called American Letters. Why is an Italian economist in Milan writing about America in the 1780s?
Well, to understand that, you have to understand the prevailing view of America in Europe at that time. There was this Dutch geographer named Cornelius de Pauw.
Pauw, I feel like he's going to be the villain of this section.
He is the quintessential villain of bad science. De Pauw was Europe's foremost authority on the Americas, despite the fact that, and this is the key, he had never actually visited the Americas.
Of course not. The classic armchair expert.
The ultimate one. From his library in the Netherlands, Pauw claimed that the American natives were inferior to Europeans. He argued that the climate and geography of the Americas were degenerate, that it was swampy, cold, the air was bad, and therefore the people were degenerate too. It was this very Eurocentric, deeply racist and dismissive view.
And Carli wasn't buying it.
Not for a second. Carli just rejected Pauw's preconceptions entirely. He saw them for what they were. Prejudice masquerading as geography.
So what did he use instead? What was his source?
His counter-argument relied on a different source, a man named Francisco Javier Clavijero. Clavijero was a Jesuit from Mexico. He knew the culture firsthand. He spoke the languages. After the Jesuits were expelled from Mexico, he lived in Italy, and Carli read his work and was blown away.
So Carli is basically saying, hey, maybe we should listen to the guy who actually lived there, rather than the guy who's just guessing from a Dutch library.
Right. Precisely. And Carli went deep into what we would now call comparative anthropology. He started comparing pre-Columbian civilizations, specifically the Aztecs and Incas, with the ancient civilizations of Europe, Africa, and Asia. He wanted to show on a point-by-point basis that they were equals.
What kind of comparisons was he making?
Well, warfare, for one. He looked at the valor of the Aztecs fighting against the Spaniards and compared it to the ancient Persians fighting King Darius. He was trying to show that these weren't savages. They had a martial virtue and a code of honor comparable to the classical heroes of the Old World.
He's trying to put them on the same level, using a language that Europeans would understand and respect.
Exactly. And he talked about the Incas too, right? I recall seeing a very surprising word he used to describe them in the notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
This one is pretty shocking for the time. He described Inca society as a theocratic monarchy that ruled over a communist society.
A communist society. In the 1780s, that word feels very anachronistic.
It does to us. But he wasn't using it in the Marxist revolutionary sense we think of. He was using it to describe a communal lifestyle. He saw that the Incas had this system where land was distributed, nobody starved, the state managed all the resources for the public good.
So from his perspective as an economist.
Right. To Carli, the economist, this wasn't savagery. It was a highly sophisticated, functioning economic system. He actually argued they were happier and better cared for than many poor Europeans at the time.
That's a bold stance to take in 18th century Europe, but he went further than just saying they are happy. He found technical links, didn't he? Specific, tangible things.
He did. He drew an analogy between the quipos, those knotted ropes the Incas used for record keeping, and ancient Chinese knotted ropes mentioned in historical texts.
That is a really specific connection. Knotted ropes in Peru and knotted ropes in China.
It is. And he didn't stop there. He pointed out that the Americans actually taught the Europeans better techniques for dyeing fabrics and certain types of stoneworks. He was flipping the script, saying the knowledge transfer wasn't a one-way street.
But the big one, the one that really mattered to these guys, was astronomy.
Right, because for the Enlightenment, astronomy was the ultimate yardstick of a civilized society. If you could track the stars, you were a serious civilization.
Exactly. And Carli argued that the Americans had exact knowledge of astronomical phenomena. He noted that in some respects, their calendars were actually more advanced than the ancient Greeks or Egyptians.
More advanced? How so?
Specifically, he pointed out their corrections for the motion of the sun and moon. They had a more precise understanding of the length of the year and the lunar cycle than many old world cultures had at similar stages.
Okay, so Carli builds this really impressive case. The Americans are sophisticated, they have ancient knowledge, and this knowledge looks suspiciously similar to what we see in Egypt, in China, in Babylon. So what does this all mean?
For Carli, it meant one thing: connection. He concluded that in a remote epoch, there must have been communication between the two hemispheres. He looked at customs, religion, hieroglyphs, calendars. He saw a shared heritage, a common ancestor.
And this leads us to the A word, Atlantis.
Atlantis. Carli believed the traditional tales reported by ancient writers like Plato weren't myths, they were history. He theorized that there was a large continent in the Atlantic Ocean.
The classic location. The one Plato talks about.
Yes, the classic view. He placed it roughly from 40 degrees north to 40 degrees south latitude. A massive bridge connecting the old world and the new.
But here is where Carli the economist shows up again. He doesn't just say it was there. He tries to date when it vanished, using this really clever piece of deductive reasoning.
This is one of my favorite parts of his whole theory. It's the iron and money deduction.
Explain that. It's so cool.
Carli noted two very important things that Native American civilizations didn't have when Europeans arrived. They didn't use iron, and they didn't use money in the sense of coinage.
Okay. A pretty basic observation.
But he turned it into a brilliant piece of logic. The old world did use iron and money, and they had been using them for a very long time. So, Carli reasoned, the connection between the hemispheres must have been severed before iron and money were invented in the old world.
That's brilliant. If the bridge had still been there when the Hittites were smelting iron, the Americans would have eventually gotten it through trade.
Exactly. Technology spreads along trade routes. Since the Americans didn't have it, the route must have been cut off. He used this to triangulate the date. Based on cosmic cycles he studied from Egypt and China, combined with his technology gap, he estimated that the continent disappeared about 6,600 years ago.
So we have a missing continent in the Atlantic, vanishing around 4600 BC. But continents don't just sink. How did Carli, the rational economist, explain the mechanism of its disappearance?
This is where the economist becomes a catastrophist. He believed in a cosmic collision. Carli proposed that a large comet collided with the Earth.
Comet.
A comet. And he believed this impact changed literally everything about our planet. He argued that before the comet, the Earth was actually closer to the sun. He thought the year used to be exactly 360 days long.
Which would explain why so many ancient calendars from around the world use a 360-day base and then tack on 5 extra sort of unlucky days at the end.
Exactly. He felt the collision pushed the Earth's orbit out, changed the length of the year to 365 days, altered the inclination of the planet's axis, and crucially for his theory, redistributed the oceans.
So the water from the ocean sloshed over the land.
Like water in a bathtub that's been kicked. Drowning Atlantis and, in the process, explaining why you find marine fossils on top of mountains. It was his grand unified theory of ancient history and geology.
Was this idea of a comet hitting Earth considered, fringe back then?
No.
Or was death by comet a mainstream worry?
Oh, it was a mainstream panic. The source mentions this incredible anecdote about the astronomer Jérôme Lalande. In 1773, he was supposed to present a paper on comets to the Academy of Sciences. Rumors started spreading that he had predicted an imminent collision.
Panic in the streets.
Absolute mass hysteria in Paris. People were rushing to churches, requesting last rites. The archbishop had to put out a statement. Lalande himself had to publish an essay saying, everyone, please calm down. I'm just talking about orbits and probabilities. But Carli, being the math guy, actually looked at the probability. He looked at the odds of a collision. Lalande estimated 1 in 76,000. Another astronomer, Du Séjour, said it was more like 1 in 758,000.
Those are pretty long odds.
They are, but Carli compared it to the lottery. He said, effectively, winning the lottery is incredibly rare, but people still win. Just because the odds are low doesn't mean it didn't happen once in the deep past.
Okay, so that's Carli's world. An ancient Atlantic continent, a shared cultural heritage, destroyed by a comet, leaving survivors in America and the Old World. It's a grand story.
Now let's flip to Bailly, the astronomer. He has a completely different theory, and honestly, it sounds a lot colder.
Bailly looked at the Earth and saw a cooling ball of rock. He was heavily influenced by the Comte de Buffon, a famous naturalist who proposed that the Earth had started as a hot, molten sphere that was ejected from the sun.
So the Earth starts as a literal fireball.
Right. And Bailly asked a simple logical question. If you have a hot ball that is slowly cooling down in space, where does it get cool enough to support life first?
The poles. They'd be the first part to cool off.
Exactly, the poles. Bailly believed that the poles cooled first and became habitable, while the equator was still a burning, uninhabitable wasteland. Therefore, he concluded, the cradle of civilization Atlantis had to be in the Arctic, specifically on the island of Spitsbergen.
Spitsbergen. He thought that was the Garden of Eden, a frozen island in the Arctic Ocean.
He did. He believed that this great Arctic civilization flourished in a temperate polar climate. Then, as the Earth continued to cool, the poles froze over and the equator became habitable, forcing this great civilization to migrate south.
No, they spread out from the Arctic.
Yes, down into Asia, eventually reaching India and China and founding those civilizations.
So in his view, the ancient wisdom of India, the Vedas, the incredibly sophisticated astronomy, it wasn't invented in India.
No. Bailly was very, very specific about this. He believed the ancient Indian texts were just fables or myths. They were distorted memories of that original Arctic knowledge. He didn't think the Indians invented it. He thought they were just imperfectly remembering it. That seems, well, to put it mildly, it seems a bit dismissive of the people who are actually living in India.
It was. And this brings us to the real clash, the clash of methodologies. Because Bailly, brimming with confidence, tried to convince Voltaire of this theory.
Voltaire?
The Voltaire.
Voltaire. Bailey wrote to him, laying out this whole Arctic theory. And Voltaire played the part of the polite, humble skeptic. He described himself as an old blind man, just asking for help finding his way.
That's a classic Voltaire move.
Totally. But then he asks this very simple, devastating question. Why couldn't the Indians have invented astronomy themselves? They have a great climate for it. It's clear at night. They need it for agriculture. Why do we need to invent this whole complicated story about them migrating from the North Pole?
A very valid question. What did Bailey say? How did he defend it?
Bailey's defense was incredibly revealing about his entire worldview. He wrote back, "A palace is not built by children."
Yeah. He believed that early humans used imagination, which created fables, before they developed reason, which created science. He implied that the Indians were in the childhood phase of humanity. They could tell stories, but they couldn't build the palace of scientific astronomy. Therefore, they must have inherited it from an older, more mature civilization.
That is quite the worldview. The arrogance is breathtaking. So how did Carli react to Bailey's Arctic theory?
Carli went on the offensive. He called Bailey a magician.
A magician? Like a wizard casting spells?
More like a stage magician, an illusionist. Carli accused Bailey of using alluring violence to force the reader to believe his specific worldview. He said Bailey was so eloquent, so persuasive with his writing, that he could trick you into seeing things that weren't there.
Alluring violence. That is a powerful phrase. It's like saying he's intellectually gaslighting his readers.
That's a great way to put it. And Carli went even further. He argued that Bailey actually knew the truth, that Atlantis was in the west, in the Atlantic, but that he was trapped by his own rigid theory about the cooling Earth. He was forced by his own system to invent what Carli called a romance about the Arctic.
A romance, meaning a complete fiction.
Exactly. Carli just shredded Bailey's method. He said Bailey was taking bits of poetry, ambiguous fragments from mythology, apocryphal writings, and mashing them all together to create a flood of fables. Carli said he was just confused by it. He couldn't follow the logic because it wasn't history. It was storytelling masquerading as science.
Okay, this is where we really need to slow down and unpack what's happening here because it's the core of the whole issue. We have two very smart men. One says Atlantic, one says Arctic. They're both looking at the same world, at the same ancient texts, but they are seeing two completely different histories.
And this brings us to the core of Elio Antonello's paper. He stops just narrating the history and pivots to the big question of demonstration.
Right. This is focus area 1, the criteria for a possible demonstration. The core question Antonello asks is, how do we distinguish between a fun theory, a romance, and a rigorous scientific demonstration, especially in a field like cultural astronomy?
Because it's not like physics, right? You can't put a civilization in a test tube and run an experiment.
Exactly. And Bailey actually addressed this problem in his letters to Voltaire. He said, doubt must have limits. He admitted that you can't prove history with the certainty of a geometric theorem. But he argued that if you combine enough testimonies and you weigh the probabilities and you compare the fables, they eventually form a strong light that leads to a kind of evidence.
So it's a convergence of evidence approach. If I have enough myths that all seem to point in the same direction, that counts as proof.
That was Bailey's view. But Antonello, our author, compares this to a very modern problem in the field of archaeoastronomy. The problem of intentionality.
Intentionality. Okay, break that down for us. Why is that the big stumbling block?
Well, imagine you find an ancient temple, and you do the math, and you discover it aligns perfectly with the sunrise on the summer solstice.
Okay, like Stonehenge or Newgrange.
Exactly. The alignment is a fact. You can measure it. It is mathematically precise. But here's the question. Did the builders intend to do that? Or did they just happen to build a temple facing east because, I don't know, the terrain is better that way and the alignment is a complete coincidence?
Right, because if you have enough ancient buildings and enough stars in the sky, eventually something is going to line up just by pure chance. It's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. You shoot the side of a barn 100 times, and then you go and paint the bullseye around the tightest cluster of holes.
Precisely. Intentionality is the ghost in the machine. You can measure the alignment. That's physics and math. You can say, this wall aligns with the rising of the star Sirius to within mall 1 degrees. That is a hard scientific fact.
But you cannot measure the intent of the person who laid those stones thousands of years ago. That's not physics. That's anthropology. That's psychology. It's a different domain of knowledge.
So how do modern scholars try to solve this? The paper mentions a modern archaeoastronomer named Bradley Schaefer.
Yes, Schaefer proposed a kind of checklist, 4 criteria you need to meet to have a strong case for intentionality. And Antonello does something brilliant here. He maps them onto Bailey's 18th century logic to show us exactly what's missing.
Okay, so what are the 4 criteria?
First, there's statistical significance. That's the math. Is this alignment so precise or so rare that it's very unlikely to be chance?
Okay, that's the hard science part. That's Bailey's weighted probabilities.
Exactly. Second, archaeological information. What's the physical context? Did they build other things like this? Is there a clear line of sight? Does the archaeology support the idea that they were observing from this spot?
That feels like Bailey's balanced testimonies, looking at the physical evidence.
Right. Third is the astronomical case. Would this alignment actually be useful for them? Did it help them create a calendar or predict seasons for planting crops? Or was it important for their religion? Does the astronomy make sense?
Makes sense. So far, Bailey seems to be trying to do all this. So where did he go wrong?
It's the fourth criterion, the most important one, ethnographic evidence. Do we have texts or oral traditions or historical records that say these people actually cared about this star or this celestial event? What did the builders themselves or their descendants tell us about their desires and their knowledge?
And that's where Bailey's whole system falls apart.
It completely collapses because he dismissed the actual cultures, the Indians, the Egyptians, as children. He ignored what they actually said about themselves and their own history and substituted his own grand, overarching romance about the Arctic. He failed the ethnography test because he had contempt for his sources.
So even if the math works, even if the building points the right way, if you don't understand the culture on its own terms, you don't have proof. You just have a coincidence.
Precisely. And Antonello warns about the ambiguity here. Just because you have rigorous math, the statistics, it does not mean you have a rigorous proof of intent.
And the public gets confused by this.
Very confused. The public sees the word astronomy and archaeoastronomy and assumes it's a hard science, like physics. They think, oh, they calculated it with a computer, so it must be true.
But it's really a soft science anthropology wearing a hard science hat.
Exactly. Intentionality is outside the realm of physical science. Physics doesn't care about human desires or beliefs. So when a researcher says an alignment is probable, that one word is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's a dangerous word. It creates an illusion of scientific certainty where there's only, educated speculation.
This connects right back to Carli calling Bailey a magician. Bailey used the language of science probabilities, cooling rates, astronomical observations to sell a story that was, at its heart, a romance, a fiction.
And that brings us right to focus area 2, the human psyche. Why do we do this? Why did Bailey, a certified genius, an incredible astronomer, convince himself that the Garden of Eden was in the Arctic?
Well, the paper mentions that both Carli and Bailey engaged in selection.
They did. They cherry-picked their evidence, they highlighted the proofs that fit their ideas, and conveniently ignored the weak points or contradictory facts. But there was a key difference between them.
Carli sort of knew what he was doing, right? He called his own work a novel or a pastime.
Yes. Carli admitted his American letters were a kind of intellectual game. He was playing with ideas. He was the skeptic, even of his own theories. But Bailey seemed genuinely 100% convinced. He wasn't playing. He had fallen in love with his own theory.
The paper brings up Sigmund Freud here, which is a great connection. It talks about the psychopathology of everyday culture.
It's a brilliant turn of phrase. Freud wrote about the psychopathology of everyday life, slips of the tongue, forgetting names, all the little ways our subconscious messes with us. Antonello suggests we have a collective version of that, a psychopathology of everyday culture.
And what's the diagnosis?
The diagnosis is simple. We fall in love with our own ideas. We become so invested in a theory we've created that it becomes part of our identity. And then we can't let it go.
It's the fixed idea.
Yes. The astronomer Lalande, who knew Bailey, well, remember, the comet panic guy, actually wrote about the psychological flaw in his friend. He said Bailey had fixed ideas and could not be brought back to the truth. No matter what evidence Lalande presented to him, no matter how politely Voltaire questioned him, Bailey wouldn't budge. His mind was made up.
It's genuinely scary because these aren't stupid people. We have to keep stressing that. These are brilliant people acting irrationally because they are so deeply wedded to a theory.
And Antonello argues this problem is getting worse, not better. In the 18th century, they had what was called the Republic of Letters. Disciplines mixed freely. An economist like Carli could debate an astronomer like Bailey on equal terms. They read everything. They were generalists.
But today we have silos. Hyper-specialization.
Exactly. Today, the astronomers are in one university building, the archaeologists are in another, the anthropologists and psychologists are in a third. They don't talk to each other, they don't read each other's journals.
So the astronomer finds a cool alignment and publishes it, but there's no anthropologist in the next office to lean over and say, hey, that's really interesting, but just so you know, that culture didn't even have a word for that star.
That's the problem in a nutshell. This separation, this siloing, allows bizarre thoughts, as Antonello puts it, to flourish. It allows pseudo-history and pseudoscience to grow in the cracks between the disciplines.
That's why we get so many modern theories about pyramids built by aliens or, well, lost advanced civilizations like Atlantis. The experts who could debunk them aren't talking to each other.
Exactly. So Bailey's Arctic Atlantis is a warning from history. It's a perfect example of what happens when a brilliant mind gets isolated in its own logic loop without cross-disciplinary checks and balances.
It's a pathology of culture, as the paper says.
Mm-hmm.
And the difficulty of the job, whether you are an 18th century scholar or a modern researcher, is that you have to master your own discipline and have the humility to understand the methods and findings of others. You need interdisciplinary rigor to stop yourself from writing a beautiful romance and calling it science.
It is so humbling. It really makes you stop and wonder, okay, what are the fixed ideas that we are holding on to right now in our own time?
And that's the conclusion, right? That's focus area 3. This whole story, Bailly versus Carli, it isn't just a quirky history lesson. It's a mirror for our own intellectual debates.
It really is. Bailey represents the system builder, the person who has a grand, all-encompassing theory and then forces every single fact to fit into it, whether it wants to or not. The Earth is cooling, therefore civilization began in the Arctic, therefore Indian astronomy is a fable. It's a rigid top-down logic.
And Carli, what does he represent?
Carli represents the skeptical empiricist. He's not perfect, he's not immune to speculation. I mean, he loved his comet theory. But his method was more bottom-up. He was more grounded in the comparative data. He looked at the actual cultural similarities in America and the Old World and asked, what could explain this?
But even Carli, with his more grounded approach, was arguing for a lost continent in the Atlantic that we now know, through geology and oceanography, doesn't exist. So they were both wrong in the end.
They were both wrong about Atlantis, yes. But their methods are what matter. Carli's method of questioning Pauw's racist assumptions and looking for real evidence in the Americas was fundamentally sounder than Bailey's method of weaving together fables to support a preconceived idea.
So the final verdict on evidence, according to our source, is that the real challenge is to distinguish cultural astronomy from pathology of culture. And that is an incredibly hard thing to do.
It really is. It's a razor-thin line between a revolutionary breakthrough and a personal delusion. And sometimes you can only tell the difference with hindsight.
This all connects to a final provocative thought for you, for the listener. If a genius like Jean-Sylvain Bailly, a man who mapped the stars, calculated orbits, and helped lead a revolution, could convince himself that Atlantis was in the frozen Arctic based on a collection of fables,
Then what are we convincing ourselves of today?
right? What is the elegant, all-encompassing romance that we have written for ourselves, either individually or as a culture? What are our modern-day Arctic Atlantises?
Think about the line between a fun urban myth or a conspiracy theory you see online and a dangerous delusion in science or politics. Bailey's delusion was, in a way, harmless. It was just a theory in a book. But the kind of thinking behind it, the confirmation bias, the refusal to see contrary evidence, the use of alluring violence to persuade, that is profoundly dangerous.
And in our world of information overload, where you can find proof for absolutely anything you want to believe with a few clicks on the internet, the warning is louder and more urgent than ever. We need to be so careful not to build these beautiful palaces for ourselves out of fables.
A palace is not built by children, Bailey said. But perhaps the real lesson from his story is that even the smartest adults can build castles in the air if they aren't constantly, rigorously, and humbly checking their own foundations.
That is a perfect place to leave it. We want to thank you for taking this journey into the 18th century mind with us. It's been a fascinating trip.
It's been a pleasure, and we really encourage you to look at proof and evidence with a sharper, more skeptical eye next time you see a headline about a lost civilization or a grand new theory of everything.
This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.